Hi, I'm Phil from Woodsmith, and I'm here to get started on my next project. Now, I'm switching gears from furniture projects to something for myself and my own shop. I've wanted for a while now a full-size router table. The problem is my workshop in the back of the garage just doesn't have a lot of space. But our creative director, Chris Fitch, came up with this, a just right router table. Now, the reason that it's just right is that it's not very big, just a little bit larger than what a benchtop router table size would be. So that means it can tuck in a little corner of my shop and still provide all the functionality that I want. So I can have my full-size router in here and handle all the large joinery bits that I want to use on it. Now, I'm making a couple of modifications to the original plans. One of the first things you'll see is that the opening for the router bit is off center. And there's a reason for that. Inside the cabinet, I'm incorporating a shop-built router lift. And in order to get the router in and out easily, I needed to move it off to the side. Not a big deal because I'm providing most of my workpiece support on the in-feet side, and there's going to be a lot of space on the opposite side to carry that workpiece past and through the cut. Another thing that I wanted to incorporate on this particular plan is a power switch that I've located on this side so I can easily turn the router on and off and have that bit more of control while I'm routing. The project also has a plastic laminate covered top for durability and to have that workpiece slide across smoothly. The fence is easy to build and easy to adjust and incorporates auxiliary faces that you can customize to match and suit specific tasks or bits that you have in your shop. This is a pretty easy project to make. I'm going to get started with the case on here, an MDF case with solid wood legs. I'm going to paint it so that it has a color scheme that goes with some of the other projects that I've built for my own workshop. Feel free to change those up. If you're ready to get started on it, you can find the plans for the Just Right router table at woodsmithplans.com. This is also a great opportunity to join Woodsmith Unlimited. One of the perks of that is getting 6 free plans every year in addition to all the other benefits. The Just Right router table can be one of those plans for your shop. So let's get started on cutting up pieces for the case. All right, the first step in our process of making the router table is cutting the case pieces to size. Now, on the original one, Chris made everything out of MDF. It's inexpensive and easy to shape. However, I'm going with a slightly different material here. It looks like plywood from the top, but if you look on the edges here, what you'll see is that it's plywood, it's the face veneers over an MDF core. So it's got all the benefits of working with MDF, really easy to cut, but we have the plywood surface on here. The reason I'm using it is that there are several leftover pieces laying around from some other project. They're like not big enough to use in a big piece, but just right to be able to be used up for this router table and then get painted over so nobody will be any of the wiser. So what I'm going to do first here is I've set the rip fence for a 14.5-inch cut. That matches the width of the 2 sides as well as our 2 dividers. I'll take care of all of those at once before cutting the back and then parts to length. I try and make a point of batching all of my cuts so that the parts that need to be the same size, whether it's width or length, are all cut at the same time. I'm just not that good of resetting up something to try and nail it a second time. So what I've done here is position the rip fence to cut the back and then the 2 side pieces to their final length. Now, quick word here about the blade that I'm using. It's called a melamine blade, also sometimes called a plywood blade. What I like about it is that the teeth on it have a very high angle alternating. So it gives me a really clean cut. It's not such a big deal on the MDF, but when I'm cutting stuff with a veneer face, I get a real crisp, clean line. And with the MDF, it still cuts pretty fast. All right, after cutting all of our pieces to size, the next thing to do is to install a dado blade, which sounds simple enough, but the key thing here is that we want the width of that dado blade to match the thickness of our plywood pieces. Easier said than done. I ended up going through quite a few setups here trying to dial in adding and removing shims in order to get a setup that I like. And this one is kind of right on. I have to kind of press the pieces together, but that's what I want. So what I have now is adjusted the rip fence to set up and cut a dado for the middle divider in our case, and I'm going to cut that dado on the two sides as well as the back. All right, while I still had the wide dado blade set up, I added an auxiliary fence to the rip fence to cut wide rabbets along each side of the back panel. And those are going to capture the two side pieces here just to help with some registration when it comes time for assembly. Now what I need to do is turn this wide dado blade into a 1/4 inch dado blade, reduce the size of my dado stack here to just the two outer chippers and a shim in order to make a 1/4 inch wide kerf. We're going to use that to cut narrow dados at the top edge and bottom edge of the back and the two side pieces, and then we'll cut matching tongues on the bottom and then some upper dividers. So it's a pretty simple process here and goes pretty quickly. All right, we're down to the last joinery step here, and what we need to do is to cut a tongue on each end of the bottom of our case piece here to fit into the narrow dado at the bottom of the case. Now remember, we cut narrow dado at the top, and that's going to hold a pair of cleats that we'll use to attach the top of the router table down the road when we get to that point. So we need to cut that tongue along one edge and one end as we go along. All right, it's time for the assembly here. There's just going to be a lot of glue and clamping. You want to have a mallet with you just to encourage parts to come together the way that they should. The other thing that I did is to use a sanding block and just kind of ease all the edges that are going to fit into the various dados. It's just going to help the parts slide together without any chipping. So what I'm going to do is start with one of the side pieces here, and I'm going to put a healthy bead of glue in the full width dado and then align the intersecting divider so that it's flush at the front and back edge. And as necessary, just kind of give it the encouragement that it needs to go together. Then I'll do the same thing here at the bottom, where I'm going to put a bead of glue in the dado and then on the shoulder of it. So then I can set the case bottom into place. Again, just making sure that it's flush. It doesn't have to be perfectly tight at this point because we'll bring it together with clamps as we go along. So then what I want to do, attach the back by running a bead of glue on that rabbet, and then in the dado. MDF is pretty porous, so you can be a little generous with the glue here. All right, now I'm ready to add the other side. All right, with the joints fit together, I'm going to add some clamps now just to pull things tight and make sure all the pieces are aligned the way they should be. All right, at this point I have the joints pulled tight down here. I'm going to grab a couple of more clamps to pull the back so that it's snug up against the sides. And we just got to wait for the glue to dry. All right, once the clamps come off of the case for our router table, you can do a little cleanup on any glue squeeze out, especially on the outside, just to straighten everything up. Now, one thing that I want to point out that I ended up doing just before we did the glue up is I flipped this case over. Now, in the original plans, this would normally be the top, and this shelf would be about 11.5 inches down from that. However, if you'll remember from our intro, I'm going to be using this version of a shop-made router lift inside the cabinet. And in order for that to work with this kind of distance, I flipped it upside down so that I can still use this lift and have enough clearance for the lift and the router on the inside. It's kind of a small change, but something that you can easily do with a project like this. Another solution is to just simply change the location of the divider, and it's best to do that at the planning stage rather than just before you start squirting glue on the parts here. Next step is to flip this face down, and we're going to ease the back corners with a roundover. Now the doors that will get attached to the front will have the same roundover, so we have that consistency in the look, but I want to take care of this before we move on to other parts. We're going to set the case for our router table aside now and start working on the 4 legs, and that adds the main visual draw to this piece because they have that flared shape for visual appeal and stability. Now the original plans called for having rectangular blanks to cut those from, but I have some rough boards of white pine that I'm going to make my legs from. And I'm going to use the bandsaw for most of the work here, so I don't really need straight edges. What I did to get started was to make a hardboard or 1/4 inch MDF template of what the final shape of the leg is going to be like. Then I could take a white colored pencil or chalk pencil and get some rough outlines to see how I can get a couple of legs to nest on a piece like this. And then I have a longer board that's a little narrower, and I can do the same thing here. So the idea at this point is to just make sure that I can get 2 legs out of each of these pieces. The specific sizing will wait a little bit because, as you can see, the surfaces are pretty rough. It's a little thicker than I want, so that's why we're here at the jointer. And this one's a combination machine, so it's got a jointer and a planer built into it, and I can tackle these wider boards on here, which is a nice advantage. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the cupped face down, flatten the face on both of these pieces, and then plane them to their final thickness. All right, now that we have a clean face on each of our leg blanks, the next step is to bring them to the final thickness. So I've converted the jointer into a planer. What this means is lifting up the jointer tables and flipping over the dust hood. Then I can crank the planer bed into its approximate position that I'll need to feed pieces through. Last step is to just attach the dust collection hose on the back side. Hopefully it stays connected while we work here. So I want to leave the leg blanks as thick as possible. That's going to add some strength, and I think it's going to look great too. So let's get started. All right, now that we have our leg blanks down to the correct thickness and all cleaned up, it's time to grab our template again and trace out the legs on our pieces. You can see on this long one here, I've got a really nice section for this one. A little bit of a knot going on down here. I'll see what I can do about that. This one is looking pretty good too. And then I can just line this one for the 4th leg, then trace it out. From here, the next step is to head over to the bandsaw where we can cut these pieces apart. My first step is to just kind of roughly split this in order to be able to focus on a much smaller blank. And I'm going to try and get as close as I can to my layout lines, but staying just to the waist side in order to be able to clean up those blade marks. All right, my typical method of cleaning up parts where I have multiples is to use a router table and a flush trim bit along with a pattern. We don't have a router table yet. So I'm going to use hand tools here, and since the legs are white pine, it's going to go pretty quickly. So I can show you what I'm doing. I'm going to start with this tapered section on the inside of the leg, and I'm just going to use a block plane And I'm going to follow the lines that I drew when I traced the template earlier, but I'm really more concerned about getting straight, smooth surfaces that feel good rather than trying to nail getting right to that layout line. So you can see here I've planed a little bit, and I still have some blade marks here and then down here towards the end. Once I get those removed and it's a nice smooth surface, I'm done. On the outside of the leg, we have a couple of things going on. First of all, we have this curved section, and then that leads into a long, straight part of the leg. For the curved part, I have a spoke shave here that I can use to refine that edge and then remove any blade marks as well. And then I usually check it with my hands because your fingertips can feel any lumps and bumps that you're getting, and kind of eyeball it with your layout lines to see where you are. For the long straight section, it's back to the block plane. Just pay attention to the grain direction. So I'm going to go this way with it. And then again, I'll work to the layout lines on this side. You're going to run into some trouble where the curve meets the straight section, and then here I'm also dealing with some knots. So whatever I can't get with the spoke shave, I'm going to grab a curved file and a rasp, and I can deal with that and get into it and then clean it up the rest of it with some sandpaper. It's the same sort of story on this side, this long flat section here. I'm going to use a straight edge in here just to make sure that I keep it flat while I'm working, because this has to attach tightly to the case of the router table. The final thing is taking care of this step. I cut pretty close to the line, but it's still a little short. So I'm going to clamp that vertically in the vise, and then I'm going to use a shoulder plane, and I can refine that shape because the shoulder plane will let me get right into the corner where those two surfaces meet. You can see I'm starting to get a little tear out here, so what I do is work from both sides, kind of working into the middle. And then I'll double check my work with a square, both going across and then where this meets that surface. So in a short amount of time, you'll be able to get these smooth and ready to go. The key thing here is getting them consistent. Nobody's ever going to be able to compare the four legs side by side once it's been attached to the router table. And if they do start looking at your router table that close, it's time to ask them to leave. So I'll get these wrapped up and then we'll work on the next part of the case. All right, we're moving right along here with the router table project. I've attached the legs to the case, but before I did that, what I wanted to do after smoothing out that profile that I cut out is to ease the sharp corners with a chamfer. Now, this would be ideal at the router table, but we're not using a router table because we're in the process of making it. So what I did is used a handheld router, and with these narrow edges of the legs, I didn't want to worry about the router tipping. So I took two legs, taped them together with some double-sided tape, and then that created a little larger surface for me to be able to run my router around and buzz that chamfer on all of those pieces. Then what I can do is I put the case up on a sawhorse and then laid out the position for the legs here. Now the front legs are just flush with the front of the case. The back legs here are inset 3/4 of an inch, so I lined those up, clamped it up, and then secured it with screws running from the inside. Now I'm using pocket hole screws here because they have that real big washer head that helps to hold it in the MDF core plywood that I'm working with here, as well as the softwood on the legs. So what I want to do is I'm just going to take a ruler and mark a line to give me a guide where I need to cut these legs off. I'm going to use a handsaw and just cut them, leaving them a little proud, and then we'll clean them up with a block plane. All right, now that I have the legs all flushed up, I marked them to indicate what side of the case they're going to be on and whether it's front or back here. Because what I want to do, kind of counterintuitive as it seems, is I'm going to take the legs off now and I can apply the clear finish to the legs after doing a final sanding. And then I'm going to do some pre-finishing on the case before bringing it all together. All right, now with the legs removed from the case, I'm ready to add the power switch that I want to use here. And it's one made by Craig, and what I like about it, there are a couple of outlets on the back side of it. So I need to make a hole on the side of the case to be able to get at the switch and to be able to access the outlets from the back side. So I've marked a layout lines on here that match the overall size of this. And then because it has this mounting flange here, I'm going to make a separate piece of 1/2-inch plywood here, make a little cutout here and attach that to the side of the case, and then I can screw that mounting flange right on there for easier access. So I'll cut this out over at the bandsaw. Keep nice straight cuts for these two end pieces, but I can't make something real tight. So I'm going to come in and kind of make a big sweeping cut from one direction and then the other in order to remove the rest of the waste here. And I'll clean things up with a file and some sandpaper. One last detail here to take care of on my mounting plate, and that's, if you notice on the back side of this power switch, the flange here has a couple of angled supports, 4 of them there, on either side of where the screws get attached. So what I'm going to do is cut some relief slots on the top face of that plate. So I've marked where each of those cuts needs to be. I've raised the blade to match the thickness of the plywood. I'm going to use the miter gauge just to slide up and make those cuts, and just before the saw blade reaches the top surface there, that's how I know where to stop that cut. All right, here's where we are on fitting our power switch to the side of the router case. So here's that filler piece that I have, and I have it just roughly installed just to make sure that the fit is right. If you lift this out, you can see what's going on here. So I had to make a hole in the side of the case. So what I did is traced where that opening was, and then I used a hand drill and a Forstner bit to give me some access points in order to remove as much of this waste as I could with a jigsaw. Then I used the bracket piece that I made earlier and another scrap piece to form a template that I used some double-sided tape to attach to the case side, and then a pattern bit in a handheld router to clean it up and trim it all up so that it could fit. I came back in with a chisel and cleaned up and squared up the corners, and then used a file to make some notches to allow those braces on the back side of the mounting flange to have some clearance there. So all that to say is that I can attach this filler piece to the side here with some glue, and then we're ready to paint the side of our case before we do the final assembly. Okay, we're ready to paint the case here. Now for something like this, I like just using one of those really firm foam rollers to be able to put on a really smooth coat of paint. I'm using acrylic milk paint, it's called. This is the coastal blue color. It's kind of like my shop color that I have going on in some of the other carts and tools and things that I've made, just to kind of unify everything, gives it a nice look. The painting itself goes pretty easy. I'm going to apply 2 coats here and sand in between just to make sure that I get a nice smooth coat, especially where those raw MDF edges are going to be. All right, putting the second coat of paint on the case here goes a lot faster than the first coat because we have that base layer down. Now after it dried, I used a sanding block with some 180 grit sandpaper on it and just knocked down all the raised dust nibs and fuzzies that are on there. And you got to be careful here because it's really easy to go too far when you're sanding and just sand away all the paint, which I don't want to do. I'm just trying to create a smooth, level surface so that when that second coat gets rolled on, it's going to look really smooth and nice here. So that's what I'm doing here. Once I'm done, I'm going to let it dry. This stuff sets up pretty fast. And then in about 45 minutes or so, I can start tackling putting finish on the inside. I'm using Old Masters water-based Masters Armor in flat because I don't really care about the sheen here. Now what I did is used a sanding block to give me some pretty crisp edges along where the paint and the clear finish are going to meet. Then I'm going to brush a coat onto the upper face of the shelf and the case bottom, and then on the two sides. I'm not really worrying about the back panel right now. Same thing goes for the bottom face of the shelf. Again, nobody's ever going to see that or notice it. So then you just wait an hour, sand it down just like we did with the paint, and then put on a second coat. All right, I got a second coat of the water-based finish drying on the inside of the case for our router table. And I want to show you the other part of the project that I've been working on, and that's to put a couple of coats of finish on the 4 legs for the router table. I have one coat on already, and the second coat goes on pretty well because you have the first coat acting like a sealer. So I'm just going to brush the inside of the legs with a light coat, making sure to get that chamfer. And then I'll work the 2 wide faces down at the bottom of the leg here. Then what I can do is go up the narrow face on each side. Wrap it up. I'm going to set it on my support blocks here, which allows me to get that last surface. Making sure I got those chamfers and then looking for any runs or drips that I may have missed. Now once this is dry, I can put the 4 legs and attach them to the case, and we're getting that much closer to the final assembly on this project. All right, when we last left our router table project, I was putting finish on the legs here and had taken care of the painting and finish for the case. Well, I've joined them together. It wasn't a big deal. It's just 4 screws for each of the legs, making sure that they were, the front legs, flush with the front of the case and the rear legs lined up just where they needed to. Having pre-drilled the holes, everything went fine. And I also have the power switch installed. Works out great. The next thing that we're going to do here is we're going to add doors to the front. These are pretty awesome because all they are just plain pieces of MDF, just slightly less than half the width of the case here. So what I'm going to do now here at the bench is that to match the detailing on the case, I'm going to route a round over along the outside edge of the doors. Then at the inside edge, we'll add some hardware in just a bit. All right, the handles for the doors are these low profile L-shaped pieces of steel that get recessed into shallow mortises on the inside edges of the doors. I'm going to take care of those mortises right here at the table saw. And while you might think you could use a dado blade, I'm just going to show you how to do it with a single blade because not every table saw can accept the dado blade. So what I've done is marked the extents of the mortise on the edge of the door, and then using the rip fence and a stop on the miter gauge, I can line up the rip fence with one side of the mortise and then use the stop block for the other side of the mortise. Now, you might be thinking that I'm just going to make 8 million passes across the blade in order to take care of this, but with such a shallow cut, and we're working with MDF here, what I'm going to do instead is slide the workpiece up so that it's contacting the blade, and then I can make side-to-side passes, allowing the blade to just kind of chew back and forth to remove all of that waste. By advancing the piece just a little bit, I can very quickly make these mortises, and all of that MDF dust goes right into the dust collector. All right, the other bit of hardware that we need to install is the hinges for the two doors here. And I'm going to use these concealed or European style hinges. And part of the reason that I like them is that there's some built-in adjustability that we'll talk about later. But the other thing is that they come into two sections. So there's this part that gets attached to the inside of the cabinet. This section gets attached to the door and has the hinge mechanism on it. On the back side, there's this piece called the cup, and that just fits into a drilled hole on the inside face of the door. And that's a great reason to like them, is because the installation is pretty simple. What you do need to do, though, is make sure that that hole is the right size, and then also that you're guiding the bit in exactly the right place, keeping it square, and that the offset from the outside edge of the door in is consistent. I'm going to use Craig Tools jig for doing this because it's really handy. It comes apart here, I'll show you. On the inside is a carbide tipped Forstner bit that matches the metric sizing of most of these types of hinges. So that's pretty cool, because the carbide tips on there are going to stand up to a lot of drilling, especially in really abrasive kind of materials like MDF and plywood and particle board. This bit's going to last for a long time. There's an attachment on here with a stop, so you're drilling to the correct depth every time, and it keeps the bit square to the workpiece. The other part of it is this plate. There's a center line on here that I can use to line up with the center line location of where the hinge needs to be. And then there are two adjustment tabs on here that control those little knobs on the underside, and that's what's going to determine the offset of the bit from the edge of the piece so that you're going to match what you need. And you'll find that information on the little piece of paper that you're very tempted to just throw away as soon as you open up your hinges, but you want to hold on to that at least for a little bit. So let me get this set up and I'll show you how it works. I'm going to line it up with my center line, and I'm going to attach it with clamps. Some folk just hold on to it, but I like having the security of not having to worry about that. Lock the bit in the drill. Lock that in the guide. So see, everything's all dialed in here. It's kind of like drill press accuracy without having the drill press. All right, with MDF, it's pretty cool because you get these shavings that make me think of the state fair and having the tater ribbon fries. But we move this out of the way. There's a perfectly sized hole, and then we'll be able to just drop our hinge into place, attach it with 2 screws, and we're ready to move on to the next step. Now I have a few more holes to drill here, but I wanted to point out one more thing. Because I added that power strip to the inside of the router table, it's going to affect where I put one of the hinges. So rather than have the hinge located much farther up, I just moved it down so that it's going to clear that power strip on the inside. It's not a big deal, it's just something to be aware of, especially when you're modifying a woodworking plan, is to just kind of keep an idea of what changes you need to make and how those can affect things later on. So once I get these holes drilled, we'll talk about installing the hinges on the other part inside the cabinet. All right, we're ready to start installing the other part of the hinge hardware, and that's this kind of cross-shaped cabinet piece. What I did was set the doors in place. Now for this project, I have them flush with the bottom of the case, and then I transferred that center line down into the case where both of the hinges are going to be located. After extending that line down, then I used another square to draw a parallel line that marks the offset and the center line for where those screws need to be installed for the hinge. I used an awl to get the hole started, just kind of twist it in there. Now I can install the hinge plate on the inside here. All right, there we go. We have the door installed, operates pretty smoothly. What you can do with these kind of hinges, you'll notice the holes are slotted on the cabinet side, so you can adjust its position up and down, and then you can also adjust the position in and out on the hinge hardware as well to be able to dial in the right fit, both so that it's parallel with the outside edge and you get good gaps between the two doors. So once I get the other door in and fit, I'm going to get those painted, and then that'll wrap up this portion of the project. All right, got a couple of coats of paint on the doors, reattached all the hardware and installed it back on the case just to wrap up this first part of our router table build project. And you can see, nice coat of paint really makes a project like this stand out. Blue is my color, although I have a little partiality towards orange, but it's nice to see some of my shop built projects all have a unified theme to it. Now in this project, we built the case for our router table, the doors, added these really cool flared legs, and then I kind of went a little off the rails on adding a power switch to this side just to have a little bit better control of the router table. In the next video, we're going to build the top and a really cool fence, and I'm going to make some modifications there as well. So if you're ready to build a router table that's pretty easy and has a just right size to it, you want to check out the plans for this. You can find those plans at woodsmithplans.com, or if you're a Woodsmith Unlimited member, you get 6 free downloads for plans among all the other benefits, and this can be one of them. In those plans, you're going to find some other things for the inside of this router table case that I didn't need. There's a dust bin that goes inside of it, as well as a series of drawers that you can make. So feel free to mix and match what you're doing. Then keep a wary eye out for that second part where we build the top and the fence. Thanks for watching, and if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below.